Hey there, Dr. G here. I am maybe doing more and more of these. I have a few things on my mind, so this is the day after I already did a video, but I want to cover some stuff that, I mean, all day long, I think, as this has gone on with this pandemic. I have these things that pop in my head, either questions I'm asking, wondering and wanting to look up, or um, frustrations. And so I imagine all of you out there are going through the same sort of emotional roller coaster, and it's frustrating because we have limited control, each of us. And so I'm trying to take a balanced approach and to look around at those things I'm grateful for. But man, I was coming home last night, and I was listening to a podcast, and that's where I want to start. I'm actually going to do a screen share because I did a little outline here and it'll help me talk more cohesively on this. So let's get that up. So I was going to title this little talk here, Do Healthy People Die from COVID-19? So I want to answer that question, and it's a little bit of a trick question. So, and again, I always preface these videos to just say, I am not the expert. Nobody is on this, right? We've got scientists, we've got people working together. I have been, ever since this started about a month ago, I've been looking into more about both viral diseases, general health, natural medicine, what we know about the pharmacology and the effects. And from history, what do we know about these kinds of viruses and outbreaks? So long story short is I have been hours on end going through the research on this and listening to this podcast last night. So Peter Attia, I think I'm saying that right, medical doctor, I believe he's got a podcast, and I believe he's a practicing expert, and he's got some great content. I found him on Instagram. So he was interviewing, though, in the podcast that you can find online if you just look up his podcasts. He was interviewing Michael Osterholm, PhD. He's what is his credential? He's an epidemiologist from University of Minnesota, expert in infectious diseases. So of course they're talking about the COVID. In this interview, he had some really enlightened comments, and that is that some things I've been hearing. There are just some things that we're hearing not as much in the media, the mainstream media, unfortunately, but the things that struck me were he was talking about those most at risk, and we're hearing more and more about these young people who are being impacted. And again, I want to be as compassionate as I can, but we need to analyze the data and look at evidence and take this with a balanced look. And that is, so he said this, I'll just read some of my bullet points. In younger people, age 25 to 50 with severe disease and hospitalization, almost 100% of them had diagnosed obesity, okay? So I'll come back to that in a bit, but also this next point. So in obesity rates for adults over 50 is 45% in the US. And that's an epidemic. And there was a YouTube video I watched a while back, but it was somebody up in the military, and I can't remember which branch, it might have been the Army, but he was talking about, this was a TED Talk actually, and he was talking about the epidemic of health decline in young people, and that we are facing a national security crisis, in that we don't have able and ready and fit individuals, especially our young people, to be able to defend this country. In fact, the military, through his work, he was heading and running a whole division that began to help optimize the health of the enlisted people who are already in there. But this is an epidemic it's going to have widespread effects, not only for national defense, but now in terms of how vulnerable our population is to an epidemic. Now, these are some points that I began to add in, taking what was said in this podcast, but I was looking up, the highest States at the highest risk for deaths, you know, and from a number of causes, but especially infectious diseases, are those with highest obesity rates. And we see that in the Midwest and the South, but it is all across the country. It's just that my prediction is that we're going to see the highest fatality rates in general, but especially in younger people in those high obesity areas, unfortunately. And then, of course, the high fatality rate is in those with comorbidities. So those are conditions that, that besides getting the viral infection, they have other diseases like chronic renal disease, hypertension, and diabetes. We already know that. They also turned this discussion to what other age group or individuals who are going to be most at risk in our country, and that includes those older adults that we already know. And there's some, you know, in every country, it's a little bit different on how the elderly are treated and where they are living. And so one of the things that's happened is that with the advancement of more heroic medicine is that we have people living longer. You know, we have more elderly people with multiple medications and many chronic diseases, and they're able to live longer. You help more people live longer, you're going to have more people susceptible to a viral infection like this. So in Michael, so the Dr. Osterholm, he said that these long-term care facilities in the US are like powder kegs. And that analogy just kind of like blew my mind, and in that it was like, yes, I was thinking that, you know, as when I live in Washington State. And so when I heard about this outbreak in Seattle, it was all of a sudden, I mean, you had people dropping dead in these elderly care facilities. I think there was one in Kirkland. I used to live in Kirkland. And I think what was it, 25 cases in one facility. And that was probably the tip of the iceberg. So this, in the contrast you were talking about in China, they don't really have a term for long-term care facilities. So we've institutionalized the individuals who, and I'll get a little bit on a soapbox here, and pardon I don't want to come across as holier than thou, but it's always bothered me how the elderly are treated here. You know, it's suddenly, and now there are some elderly who don't have family, or they have other very complex health conditions, and it could be a tremendous burden. I've known people. I had a father who died of cancer, and he was at home being cared for. We needed to get hospice. That didn't last years and years, but I've known people people who've had to care for a elderly parent or loved one. So I don't minimize that, but it's so in China, they were talking about how they don't have those facilities. They live with their family. They're taken care of by their family. This is just personal to me. I've always thought that my parents, they sacrificed to take care of me when I was at the most vulnerable. I could go off on a rant here also about those most vulnerable, and that's the unborn and these human beings. I'm not going to go off on that tangent, but we are taken care of when we're born. Hopefully, and most of us have parents who take care of us and sacrifice, and then we can't spend the last years of time with our elderly parents or those in our society by taking care of them. Anyway, a little bit of I'm kind of getting off topic a little bit, but I want to say that this concentration of elderly in these facilities, not to mention the absolute lack of basic nutrient health going on there, the diets they're being fed, the lack of, you know, they should be getting vitamin D, for instance, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But powder keg is a very applicable term to what I think is going to happen and continue what we're going to see. Hopefully not, and they're taking steps to shield those people, but having them spread out outside of these facilities would be a much better option. Now, another really interesting point that was also mentioned in this podcast, that it was like, I think, you know, sometimes we think that someone else, these smart people in our country and across the world, are gathering data. They're doing all this stuff for us to be able to have good information. You know, our government and the medical establishment does not track accurately other viral diseases, and flu-related complications. There's no standard or national reporting going on. There's an estimations and calculations. You can go to the CDC and look that up. And this was just for flu estimates for deaths in 2007, the year 17 to 18, 2018, was 61,000 deaths in the US, okay? How accurate, I don't know. They have a reference, they have a range of what the spread might be on that. And it was something like, I think between 30 and 96,000 or something. So then they take the mean or average it. So bottom line is, yes, it's a big number, but they don't really know. So that's the point. We have right now with this epidemic, a panic, and really it's an epidemic of lack of good data. And it's an over analyzing of incomplete data. We shouldn't be panicking about things that we don't really know all the details about, you know, and that's the point I'm getting at. And so when there's this constant reporting of fatality rates, you know, this is unprecedented reporting that's going on. We don't know the numbers of people who are asymptomatic carriers. We don't know all of the health conditions of all the individuals who are having the disease and suffering and even dying from it, very young to very old. So we are not tracking that. If we don't track that, we don't know the real fatality rate for most of us. So these numbers are really difficult to trust and to analyze. I mean, it gives us some direction, but I'm trying to emphasize that we need to, you know, not overinterpret all that news that's coming out. So clearly we have a poor lifestyle epidemic. That's what's going on. I mean, vaping, smoking, we'll talk about that, legalization of marijuana. You know, I'm about freedom, but our freedoms that some have chosen to use to self-destruct, and again, I'm sorry, but if you're eating yourself to death, it's a slow death, but you are going to lower your immunity. You're going to become a burden on your family and loved ones, and it's a choice, you know. It is not too late, and I'm hoping this is a wake-up call to some of us, but what I'm angry about is that you now have an entire country and places around the world in shutdown because of these choices that individuals and that we have all made. We can all learn from this. I mean, thinking about hygiene, just basic stuff, but I'm sorry, the obesity epidemic and the chronic degenerative diseases that are all preventable, and this is what our government and in the media and our medical experts aren't talking about. They're not promoting it. You know, we have the money, everything goes where the money is, you know, what's being promoted? Lucky Charms, soda, alcohol, you know, and again, you know, okay, I'm a killjoy. I'm sorry, but you know, we've now gotten to the point where every meal is supposed to be a party. You know, it's sugar, it's everything. It's out of control, and I'm taking some deep breaths. This is what's been coming. Okay, this coming plagues, these epidemics. You know, there is no free lunch. Pardon the pun, but if we aren't taking a proactive approach to self-control and to optimize health, I'm sorry, this is at what cost? You know, schools are shut down. Now, I'm not saying we don't take steps to prevent the spread of diseases, but this is going to take this snowball effect that's happening right now. It's just, this is clearly due to some very preventable things that could have been implemented. And I hope that we're learning and we're going to implement that. So the other things that were mentioned in the podcast were that we are going to have drug and intensive care shortages, largely because of these chronic diseases that we are seeing in so many age groups, okay? We have, again, higher population of elderly. We've got just the epidemic in even young people that have multiple conditions. And by the way, the data on young people, I just want to say something that it is very unlikely that we are getting accurate. I think I alluded to this already. I might be repeating myself, but these younger people were saying that they don't have any pre-existing conditions. Just because there are no diagnosed pre-existing conditions doesn't mean there aren't any. In the state of the pandemic, it is very unlikely that these individuals are being screened completely for a whole health history. unless they have a medical health record already. How many 20, 30-year-olds are going to the doctor regularly? You know, unless their diabetic pre-diabetic problem or hypertension is severe enough that they have to go to the doctor, we don't know. Many people don't go to the doctor and get diagnosed. And these people who are going to urgent care or who are getting screened over the phone, they're going to ask them questions. They're not, I mean, do you have hypertension? Do you have diabetes? Do you have pre-diabetes? Do you have chronic kidney disease? They're not going to know unless they were tested for. So my point is there's this fear mongering going on where they're promoting all these young people who are ending up dying from this. And again, sympathy, of course we want to prevent that, but let's be clear about that data and realize that there are some things that are going on there that, you know, and this kind of comes back around to, do healthy people die from COVID-19? And it's a bit of a trick question. But my answer is no, okay? Now, number one, we all die of something eventually, but healthy people don't die from COVID-19, okay? And I can answer that conclusively just based on, in a general sense. And again, one exception, a few exceptions don't negate the general thing that I'm trying to get across, and that is, if a healthy person dies from COVID-19, it is very possible, and I would argue almost 100% certain, that they weren't healthy. There was something, you know, whether it's a genetic condition that was undiagnosed, whether it's an increased vulnerability that we can't identify. So I'm kind of tricking with this healthy, you know, how do we define healthy? Okay, I'm saying somebody that is in optimum perfect human health. And if they are in optimum health, then the healthy immune system is going to be able to fight this. And I want to use that point to just empower people that you have so much control over this. So a few other things I'll just kind of go through. Dr. Stephen Smith was quoted as saying 100%, this is a doctor who's treating cases, and I don't have the reference right now of where he's actually located, but he said 100% of severe cases seen in those under age 70 were obese, diabetic, or had pre-diabetes. Now, just really quick, and these are just some going through a couple of topics that I came across that I thought were really interesting and helpful, and that is smoking. I realize that many people who are addicted to smoking, it is easier said than done. I am not a smoker, never been. And so I know it's one of those addictions that are hard to break, just like diet change and other drug addictions. They're extremely difficult. But if you let this be a motivator, if you are smoking now, you should stop. I mean, I won't even go into the research and data on that. But, you know, they're essentially, this was through, I think this was on WebMD, this quote. The odds of disease progression, including to death, were 14 times higher among people with a history of smoking. He was calling on the public to stop smoking and vaping. This was a physician, health professional that was quoted as saying this, and to steer clear of secondhand smoke. So you know, again, if you've got children in your home and you're smoking and you're not going outside, please stop. And the vaping, you know, e-cigarettes, there's been, what is it, probably 2,000 plus now, I referenced here, that cases of severe lung damage and death were reported amongst vapers. So also, I didn't put a reference on this, but if you're smoking marijuana and it's legal, good for you, but you are increasing your risk as well for lung disease. So it's just, you know, common sense on those points. But so I'd like to say a couple of things. Actually, I'll come back to the keys of not dying from COVID-19 that I put together today. I want to talk about vitamin D real quick, and one other point, dietary related. So it's interesting, I've just been going through all this research, and this ACE2 receptor / enzyme, this is an important enzyme that was discovered only about a decade ago, actually a little more than that, maybe it's been 2 decades. ACE2 is very interesting, and that the coronavirus uses it is also extremely interesting. And ACE2 has so many widespread implications on the health within the body. It would be you know, I spent hours combing through this research, but a couple of points that came up. Vitamin D upregulates this enzyme, okay? Now, we know vitamin D helps the immune system, but it is extremely important. And I point that out because it's extremely important. It's very easy to take it, to increase it, to get that. It's long been known that these waves of the flu epidemics, of these infectious diseases, they go through a cycle where during the months when we have least sun exposure, there's increased rates and deaths for that matter. So vitamin D, though, it's really fascinating. And therefore, so why do we want to increase ACE2? So clearly raising ACE2 activity in the body has increased benefits. So it improves insulin sensitivity, it decreases blood sugar, lower blood pressure, lower chronic disease of the kidney disease, etc., on and on. Almost every organ system has been linked to this important enzyme. We see a deficiency of ACE2 in things like diabetes and these chronic diseases. I would make the leap that this high processed carbohydrate and sugar-rich diet is largely contributing to the whole cascade of diseases, including weight gain, but it lowers ACE2, raises blood pressure. Also interesting is that exercise increases ACE2, not a surprise. So we know, as I talked in my other video, all those things that can lower blood pressure, those are all things that likely affect ACE2 and its downstream effect. There's other enzymes that are cascaded downward that affect the whole body. So another fascinating connection with vitamin D and obesity was calcium and phosphorus intake. And it was just fascinating because there's been a lot of vilification of consuming dairy. Now, I'm not a fan of most processed dairy foods because of the additives and the high sugar content. However, it is a high source of some good proteins and of calcium. So fermented dairy from organic sources, you want full fat, etc. It is a healthy food. And it actually shows that foods that are higher in phosphorus have an inverse correlation with obesity. Now, what are foods high in phosphorus? Well, grains and legumes, nuts and seeds even, and beans, of course, and nuts, but grains. Now, when you process these foods and eat so much of them, and I'm especially thinking of processed wheat and grains, not to mention the soda, you're essentially getting a much higher phosphorus intake balance, and it has a very, it lowers calcium, you lose calcium in the process, and it has many degenerative negative effects as it's been studied. So that's why I advocate for a low grain diet and low sugar. So what are we doing here? So just a couple of things, 4 things I put here, keys to not dying from COVID-19. So stress reduction, get your hormones tested and basic metabolic status. You know, if you don't know where you're at with stress, again, yes, you can de-stress and do all these things. You can do this from the comfort of your own home or your backyard. But in my experience, many adults have chronic stress that's led to a decline in hormones. And once you end up with some of these hormone deficiencies, it's very difficult to sometimes de-stress. I mean, you can end up with anxiety, depression, these dysfunctions that lead to a downward spiral and are hard to break out of. Basic metabolic tests, so it's some people, again, don't know that they have impaired fasting glucose. They don't know they have an imbalance in their lipids and inflammatory markers. And so I highly recommend that screening. Basic blood test. Stress reduction techniques, loss of fat. So how do we lose fat? Well, it isn't about exercising and eating less, okay? It's about changing the composition of the diet and changing your mindset and your beliefs about that and getting empowered so that you can break free of the addictive process with that. It's hard, and that's why I've created and working with another clinic where we are trying to support patients through the process of going low carb and using targeted things to help break the cycle. And a big part of that is that hormone support that I do. So basic nutrition, though, number 3, eat good Food. It's got to be vitamin mineral rich, and the phytonutrients from foods, those are our protective things. These are the things that our bodies are designed to need to survive. If you neglect that, you will suffer the consequences: weight gain, weak immunity, all kinds of health conditions. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. So targeted supplements, you know, basic multivitamin that's going to be bioavailable and absorbable. And then fourth, targeted nutrients. And this is where, again, some of us have certain conditions, or we're actually suffering, say, from a viral infection. We can target other nutrients, as I've talked about in other videos. So just those last few points, I'm kind of going to end here, but I highly recommend the keto diet in one shape, form, or another. It's the most powerful dietary change that I've seen, and it's absolutely so helpful and relevant today. Metabolic hormone testing, I already mentioned it, the targeted supplementation. These are all things that I work specifically with patients to get more directed attention on. Regular meditation, breathing exercises, and water therapy. These are just 3 categories of things that are vital for me. It's so simple. You can do this from the comfort of your own home. We have the internet with YouTube. I'm following Wim Hof's techniques, and there's the constitutional hydrotherapy and grounding. I didn't write that one down. But find physical activity that you enjoy. And, you know, even with social distancing, you can do this even indoors or out. But find something, and I realize it might not be enjoyable to break a sweat, but you know, the benefits outweigh the discomfort, the minor discomfort you start with. But try to be something you enjoy. Turn off the media. So, and on that point, I'm going to call this a wrap. I thank you for watching. I thought this would be really short, but it went a little long. Anyway, hope you're staying healthy and well. Deep breathe. I need to do some de-stress now after doing this video. So I appreciate any questions, comments, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.